The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
We are sensory creatures. We know through our senses. This is called somatic knowledge of our senses. Theology begins with the senses in many ways, and Christian theology particularly, because Christian theology begins with the person of Christ, incarnation, the Word becoming flesh.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Joel Clarkson is a composer, an audiobook narrator, a songwriter, and an author. His new book is Sensing God, Experiencing the Divine in Nature, Food, Music, and Beauty. Joel makes the case in this book that the spiritual life isn't just spiritual. We experience God through our senses. That truth seems especially relevant to writers who are forever trying to give abstract truths a local habitation and a name. So I got in touch with Joel to ask him about it. Joel Clarkson, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast this morning.
It's great to be here.
I say this morning, it's morning for me. It's not morning for you because you're in Oxford, England, locked down with your family.
That is correct. We kind of gathered from the four winds and came here for Christmas. And as folks in the UK and maybe some beyond will know, there was a sudden scare with various things here in the UK right after Christmas, Boxing Day, as it's called over here, on December 26th. Uh-huh. And we had a very sudden lockdown, which has now kept us happily cocooned in our little spaces here.
Well, I'm glad you were with your people locked down, at least. Yeah.
Me too.
So when this episode releases, this episode is released in the same week as your new book is releasing, Sensing God.
Yeah.
So tell me about that book. Right? Where's it come from? What are the big ideas that drive this book?
Absolutely. So, the book is really sort of, it's kind of sharing from my heart, both as an artist over many years, working as a musician in the film industry, in concert music, in the church, writing sacred music, and also just sort of my own journey in the church as a Christian, paying a little bit more attention to liturgy, just sort of growing in that awareness of just how hungry so many of us are. Certainly I was and have been often, for a deeper understanding of how our faith connects with the world we live in, with the world that we experience on a day-to-day basis through our senses, and especially with the sort of the things in the world that we find to be beautiful, nature, food, music, art, all of these sorts of things. How do we think about these things as Christians? And this is, of course, a really big concept that I've had to grapple with as an artist who's also a Christian. But it's something I think that everybody on some level who calls themselves a Christian has to think about, because we are all given five senses. And even if we don't paint pictures or write music or sculpt sculptures, all of us are putting our senses to work, regardless of whether we do it in a way that relates directly to our faith or not, or whether we know that it relates directly to our faith. We do make meals. We do go out in nature and enjoy it. We read books. We might strum a guitar, or play on the piano. Like, all of these aspects put our senses into work. And so this is a journey. It's kind of the culmination of a journey in many senses, of me thinking through and exploring what does it mean for us to think about faith in the context of our senses. And it's a large part of what's also led me to do doctoral research here in not Oxford, but St. Andrews, which is where I usually am in Scotland, on music and theology. And so I'm really excited to sort of bring all that together into this book.
Yeah, people talk about the sins of the flesh, but I'm pretty concerned about the sins of fleshlessness. The world we live in is so desubstantialized, so electronic, and as if the stuff of the world were information and data rather than matter.
Yeah, I think it's a particular challenge we have right now, because in some ways we've been on this train hurtling through history, as it were, especially over the past couple of decades, with the rise of information technology and the arrival of social media. And I think in some sense, we were already only just starting to grapple with the implications of that in the last several years, with thinking about, is data private or is it public? What is data? How do we, are our lives private? Are our lives what we present them as online? There's all of these big questions. And I think that COVID particularly, and having to be inside and sort of cut off a little bit from the world, has really, really, really pushed this to the fore. And so we have to sort of ask ourselves now, in a way we never have before, what does it mean to be in the world, to be embodied, to have bodies?
Yeah. And I think this is probably on the cover of your book or something, but the idea that we have this tendency to think of spirituality as something that happens, inside us. And I think, this is a podcast about writing, and, we think of writing as something that happens between our ears primarily. But the truth is, both our spiritual life and our writing life, it's a connection to a wider world that's not inside our heads.
That's right.
And it's so, a spirituality that doesn't connect us with what's outside ourselves is not much of a spirituality.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. And I think that I think this is key. I think this is sort of maybe a starting point in some ways for a theology of the senses, which is to say that before we know anything, before we understand anything, our senses are already engaged from the minute we're born. And we are sensory creatures. We know through our senses. This is called somatic knowledge of our senses. And I think that's where we begin with theology of senses. Is not to say, how can we think about theology and add the senses in? It's to say, no, theology begins with the senses in many ways. And Christian theology particularly, because Christian theology begins with the person of Christ, not an idea, but a person who lived in time and space, and whose actions that we speak about in our testimony of the gospel were all very embodied actions. Incarnation, the word becoming flesh, crucifixion, giving up Christ giving up his body on the cross, resurrection, bodily raising from the dead. These are all very much to do not just with the spiritual reality, but also with the physical reality. And of course, we just can't get away from the physical aspects of the gospel story of, fig trees being cursed and feet walking on dirt roads, and Jesus breaking the bread in the upper room and with the men after walking on the road of Emmaus. And there's these constant physical aspects. And so I think, and that does relate in many senses to writing as well, because I think, Christianity always is thinking about the relationship between word and flesh. We can't get away from it, because the heart of our faith is a word made flesh. And And I think in many senses, that's what writers do. Writers are never the sort of beginning point. They're never saying something to start the conversation off. They're always entering a conversation and responding to it.
Oh,
Even
that's
if that
great.
conversation is an unspoken conversation that reflects the world itself, as it were. And so, I think writing is always a response and then an invitation for somebody else to respond. It's never really just in my head, as it were. This is one of those ideas which it goes back several hundred years, but we just can't seem to, no pun intended, but get it out of our heads, which is this Cartesian idea that we're divided between bodies and minds, that we're really just a mind, and we kind of have these bodies that are attached to it, but really what we are is just our brain.
Yeah.
And that's just not what the world tells us or what our faith tells us.
Yeah. When I teach writing, I'm always talking about, in your writing, you are indeed conveying information, but you are more importantly conveying experience. And this is also true. This is not just when you're writing fiction. It's also when you're writing nonfiction. You are you are tapping into the bodily rhythms of your reader. I mean, as you've already touched on this, everything we know through our senses. And then we have another part of our brain that once the information comes in through our senses, then it goes to work making judgments and having feelings and making logical connections, that kind of stuff. And one of the tricky things about writing is you do have a way of short circuiting all that, right? You can go straight to the logic and the judgment and all that kind of stuff. It's just that the writing is not as effective when you short circuit the sensory.
Right. That's right. It's the strange thing that even though writing is taking something that we've experienced and then putting it into a very conceptual space, it only works if it reflects that experience. And I think that in of itself, you're right. I think that is the tell of this thing, that really in the end of it, writing is an engagement with reality, not escape from it.
Yeah. Well, Joel, you speak of becoming co-conspirators in the great work of manifesting beauty in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about that. Being co-conspirators, and you're talking about being co-conspirators with God.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, this is one of those big ideas from the book. And we've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but I said that before we know anything, you were mentioning this as well, that we experience and then make sense of that experience. And the whole of the world is that way. We are in the world, as it were, before we know anything, but we sort of experience it. And there's a givenness to creation. Yeah. And Scripture talks very broadly about the way that creation is evidence to us of who God is and what He is about. And Romans 1 talks about God's invisible attributes, which sort of are understood through what He's made. And one of my favorite passages that comes to mind, and I talk about this in chapter 1, I believe it is Colossians 1:15-20, which is this. Some people think it's a hymn, possibly an early Christian hymn or some sort of adapted hymn. And it talks about kind of the dual nature of Christ, both as the firstborn of all creation, through whom everything came into being and by whom everything is sustained, and then secondarily as the firstborn from the dead. And so it's got these two sort of little hinge words: the firstborn. He's firstborn of creation and the firstborn of the dead, through whom everything in heaven and earth will be made right with God. And we note, of course, that it says "and earth." It's the sort of this holistic sense that the God who created Christ, who created the world and through whom everything is sustained, is intending to save that creation. And there's this sort of continuity, as it were, this link between Christ the Creator and Christ the Redeemer. And again, we talked about this, that the gospel is embodied. It's embodied salvation. It's incarnation, Word made flesh. And in a certain sense, it's the same kind of thing. Word made flesh and the incarnation is heaven coming down to earth. We have the cross and the resurrection, which are very embodied. And the ascension is the reverse of the incarnation. It's the inverse of the incarnation. It is sanctified body. It is the first fruits of the dead, as Paul says, being pulled up into a heavenly reality. And so I think sort of what do we do about this? I think it tells us that there is this affirmation in the gospel story, in being a Christian and following Christ. We along with Christ recognize that the incarnation, resurrection, all these aspects are a reaffirmation that what God said at the beginning of creation, that what he made is good, and that he intends to redeem it, that it is sacred, that we within it are sacred. That, as Revelation says, we look toward a new heavens and a new earth. And so I think that when I talk about being co-conspirators in the work of manifesting beauty, I mean to say that we can't share the gospel if we don't recognize the way that we are in the world, and the world is part and parcel of how we share the gospel. It's through creation that we apprehend Christ's, this is one of those great terms that theologians use, paschal mysteries, his acts of salvation. It's through creation that we do that, through embodied works of Christ. And so to fail to behold the God who made the world and then redeemed that same world, fail to behold his work in creation, his activity in creation, would be to ignore an entire facet of the way that he's revealed himself. We are not just, it's not a neutral thing, Our sort of participating in seeing beauty in the world around us is a central part of our gospel witness, what we're called to do and what we're called to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think you may even be understating your case when you say that it's an important aspect of how he reveals himself. I mean, you're the one making the case. I don't know why, it's not just, one way is that he reveals himself is through, nature, and one way is through, I mean, it's all one thing, right?
Absolutely. It's completely connected. The God who reveals himself in creation, seeking to redeem that creation, reveals himself, not just through creation, but in creation, becoming flesh as part of that creation, and sanctifying that creation by letting himself be part of its molecules and atoms and the fabric and stuff of our world. We should never let that become a normal thing to us. It's radical, and it is in of itself beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about that the 7 stanzas at Easter, the Updike poem, and he says, let us not mock God with metaphor. The resurrection, if his flesh didn't knit back together and stand again, then the idea of Christianity is a joke.
Yes.
That we're not talking about resurrection as a symbol of something. We're talking about literally standing again on the earth.
Absolutely.
And so you talk about molecules, and I mean, I think it's so important that we remember we're talking about molecules.
Yeah, the world has ascended into the world as summed up in the person of Christ, who was embodied, who was the first fruits from the dead, whose body walked through walls not because it was less physical than the world, but because it was more physical. Because we comparatively are not what we will someday be when we are like him. When he's the first fruits, that's what we're destined for. And that reality, that person, has sanctified the world again through his presence in it, and calls us to recognize the beauty of the world as a potential touch point of God's presence for those who don't know him. It's both our reality to live out and our testimony to express.
Yeah. You, a recurring theme in your book is that we have to experience these things in order to say these things, right? You have to learn to hear the song before you can sing the song.
Yeah.
Another way you put it is, when we engage with Jesus' beauty in the world and allow it to shape us, we bear the beauty of that transfigured life in us, shining like a beacon in the dark world.
Yeah.
And again, you're talking about the spiritual life. I think it's also so relevant to the writing life, right? Mm-hmm. That we can only give what we have received. what we take in, and we can, we bear witness. We give an account of what we've seen.
Yeah,
and I think all that is so important and relevant.
It is. Yeah. Well, and I think we especially in the 20th century, I think we've come to an understanding of what it means to sort of share our faith and bear witness to Christianity in a very ideas-oriented way, where the most important thing about us is what we believe. We're sort of in a certain sense, the sinner's prayer is something we assent to. It's once we understand what's happening, and it all happens in a moment rather than something that's lived out, because the key focus is put on concepts, on the mind, on what we sort of have understood. But and that's not at all to disparage that process, because that's brought many, many people to Christ and given them a rich and wonderful faith. But I think that, again, ultimately Christian faith is about encountering Christ. And so how do we think about this as writers who are trying to bring something into being? Well, in a certain sense, what we pray is that our words will become flesh for somebody else. That that instead of us presenting the right ideas and crafting the right concepts and then kind of packaging them up and then presenting them, which is all in my head, it's just sort of like, I think the right idea, I put it onto the page and then I give it and it's perfectly received and then on we go. It's more like I have had something incarnated for me in the world that I encountered and it changed me. And then as a Christian writer, my job is to describe that and to let God do the work of incarnation through me. Not because I'm something special, or because I have capacities, because God uses earthen vessels to do his work. And so I think, you see this, people like Madeleine L'Engle and Anne Lamott talked about this in their work about writing and engaging with ideas like this through writing. The best one can be is to make oneself available to be a vessel. And I think to do that, the best way to do that is to be well engaged oneself in the world. I write this book partly because I hope that by sharing my own experience of learning the sort of the means of my senses, and whether that be through, especially this year, it's funny. I love cooking, but I did not understand what it meant to cook until this year, when I could not go get fast food or anything else. And between Joy, my sister, and I, we both live in Scotland in the same flat together. We had to cook 3 meals a day, and I got sort of the idea of cooking under my fingernails, as it were. But even more than that, I got sort of an even deeper realization of just how central and good feasting is to human experience, and what that means to all of reality. Because of course, the whole Christian story is about feasting. It begins in a garden full of plenteous fruits. It ends with a wedding feast of the Lamb. And in the very middle, of course, is the communion supper. In the middle of history, right at the very center, is this amazing meal of God giving himself for us. And so I think it's those sorts of things. It's letting our senses reveal something truthful about what we have understood about God, maybe actually helping us to understand something that we know. Knowledge is kind of a neutral thing. Information is neutral. It's a computer receives data and responds to it. It doesn't make moral judgments. Computers just algorithmically calculate things. Humans don't algorithmically calculate things. Humans don't just receive and output and input data. Humans make sense of that data. This is our sort of, perhaps our fundamental nature is to give meaning to what we receive. And so I think there's something really key in that our senses help us to give meaning to the information that we receive, and then to enact it back into the world.
Yeah. And it's, you quote C.S. Lewis that the reason is the organ of information, and imagination is the organ of meaning.
That's right.
Did I say that right?
The organ of truth, and then the
reason is the organ of truth. Yeah.
Yeah. Truth is sort of, I think, I don't want to speak too closely for Lewis. Of course, he speaks for himself and is such a wonderful writer on this topic. But just to say that truth is sort of the immutable thing which we come to run up against.
Yeah.
So for instance, the truth would be Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God, or, God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's information. It's good information, but the way that I know that it's good information is by having a context which gives meaning to those things. It gives meaning to those words, which gives meaning to those concepts and what they mean the consequences they have in my life. And so our work as Christians, both for our own faith walks and as we go out to the world and live amongst each other and others and our neighbors, is to do more than just process data.
Yeah.
It's to make meaning of the world.
Yeah. The word, I think we think of truth as somehow being about propositions, and again, which I then agree to or disagree with in my head. Yes. I've started using the word reality more often than I use. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with the word truth, but reality is, I like that word just because reality, I don't think of reality as something that I have to acknowledge in my head one way or another. It is what it is, right? I mean, and etymologically, it means thinginess. Like that in reality is the Latin word for thing.
Yeah.
Which, again, I make sense of things first with my senses rather than my brain. Again, once those sensory images come into my brain, then I start doing things with them. But reality, I'm kind of getting that from Aquinas. Aquinas talks about reality. He talks about truth and reality, but I just find it really helpful to think, a reminder that reality is that which continues to be true, whether I believe in it or not.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those ways in which we're just starting to grapple with this in Christianity, with some of the difficulties and harms of modernism, sort of the how would you say, the sort of immutability of sort of structures of what we believe. I think in some sense, the 20th century pushed Christianity and any formal construct of belief to its limit, with war, with evil, with destruction, with death. And I think that what we're starting to recognize is that what you're talking about, which is that there is this sense in which we are grappling with something we don't have a full capacity to understand or to define. And yet we are grappling with it. And, I don't have a full, this is an old tradition in Christianity. It's the apophatic tradition, the via negativa. And the via negativa, and I talk about this actually in my introduction to the book. The via negativa was a recognition that sometimes it's easy, it's more, it's holier to say to admit what we can't say about God than to try to say what we can say about God. Yeah. Because as soon as we try to say too many positive things about God, we start to put him into a box that fits perfectly of our own accord and sort of is defined the way we want him. And so some of these early Christian philosophers and theologians, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, I think in the 6th century, and many others after him. He was kind of a key figure there. Augustine certainly talked about apophatic theology, would say God is uncontainable. God is both, God cannot be said to be being or not being. He is beyond being, and of course this has created a lot of our philosophical conversations in the 20th century. But the point being, I think that our senses are a great way to sort of recognize that tension between what we want to say is true and the limitation of our capacity to control that reality, that ultimate objective, immutable reality of who Christ is and
Are you saying because we can't even pretend that our senses are infinite, whereas we can pretend that our...
Well, I think what I'd say is that God is infinite, which means that we will never be able to fully grasp or contain him in our intellect. But we are invited to participate in him mysteriously. We're invited to be redeemed and to participate in his life. This is our ultimate destiny, of those who are redeemed in Christ. And how do we begin to define intellectually, rationally, what it means to participate in something infinite? I don't think we can. We can, however, allow ourselves to let go of some of that capacity, try to control by describing, and instead, through our senses, through bringing a meal to bear, there is something that is communicated to us. Again, somatically, it's this idea of somatic knowledge, it's sensory knowledge, that we understand what it's like to participate. Bonaventure, who is a saint, a medieval saint, called the Seraphic Doctor of the Church. He talked about how when you comprehend something, when you think about it intellectually, you have to hold it at a distance. You have to sort of observe it and describe it. If you want to participate in that thing, if you want to touch it and make it tangible to yourself, you sort of move past a descriptive capacity and into a participatory capacity.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's something that our senses allow us to do. This is why perhaps we have music in worship, because there is something that even when we use words to describe something about God or to worship him, music carries our limited capacity beyond what we can actually say into a deeper participation of worship of God, and an awareness of his life working through us in his Holy Spirit. Yeah. And so I think this is part of where our senses come into play, is they work in tandem with our intellect. Our intellect takes us to a certain extent, and our senses then help us to carry forward. I think it was Aquinas, certainly one of the people who dealt with this, but also Gregory of Nyssa, a little bit, and Augustine. Church fathers and medieval theologians and many other people who believed that we had to have our senses because our senses are the locus of our desire. Our senses are, our intellect is not something which moves in any which direction. Again, it's there's a neutrality to our intellect. But our senses, we need our bodies to help us move toward God, because our senses are the locus of where our desire is. And so even though as sinful beings our desires are very flawed, God works through our flawed desires, not by destroying them, but by reorienting them to himself. And our desires are best understood through our senses, because our senses are our embodied experience of the world.
Yeah. Sounds like this sounds relevant to something you say in your book, that you talk about the importance of transforming idols into icons.
Yeah.
Which is probably safe to say, this is a matter of reordering our lives, right? The idol is a disordered, an object of disordered love.
Yeah.
Actually, you tell me what you mean.
No, you're absolutely. You're saying it exactly right. I think that's right. I mean, this is Augustine in a nutshell. In many senses, is that Augustine is, his famous quote is, "Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee," and our hearts look every which way for things which will satisfy, because we're made for satisfaction. Mm-hmm. God gave a garden and told the people, he told Adam and Eve at the beginning of time, "Be fruitful and multiply." He gave them work and creation that was fulfilling to them. We are creatures made for fulfillment. So the problem is not having desires or longing for fulfillment. The problem is that, as Lewis says in The Weight of Glory, in his sermon, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis, the problem is that our desires are too weak, is that they fall short of God's profound goodness, of what would actually satisfy those desires in their fullest sense. They fall short by looking for things which are lesser pleasures. It's not that the desire in itself is necessarily corrupted beyond any hope, beyond the point of being reformed or redeemed. Basically, every desire is a longing for something good which has been corrupted. And so faith Christian faith is not about destroying the things which were points of were things that led us into sin prior to salvation, or even things that lead into sin after salvation. It's allowing God to change them in us, to change our desires, not to end our desires. This can be hard for us because it would be easier if we could just pray, God, take away my desire for such and such, or for such and such. That's not what God does with our desires. God takes our desires and we say, God, this is a desire which has been oriented to the wrong thing. It's fallen short of your glory. Help me know how to reorient this desire to you. And I think Aquinas actually believed that the intellect needed the senses to reform itself because it was led out of sync. It was led out of its proper way by the senses, and it can only be led back into its proper way through the senses.
Interesting. That's good. Yeah. Okay. So, but you, we got a little bit off track. We need to talk about the difference between idols and icons.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So when we think about this, I think I use desire as a way to think about idols and icons because I think that those things which we put our desires towards, which are not in God, which fall short of God, that is idolatry. Idolatry is a false form of what is true in God. And so a lot of the time, what our temptation is just to destroy the idol. But God doesn't, it says in Paul says that we are dead in our trespasses to sin, but God works through us to reform and revive us. And I think that, it says we have these treasures in earthen vessels and jars of clay. I mentioned that earlier. God works through us who are imperfect beings. He doesn't throw us away. He does not discard us. We, in our fallen state, are tempted by idols, and we even become idols unto ourselves. God doesn't destroy us. He reforms us. He works through us. In our imperfection, his grace is perfected. And I think this is what we're called to do as well, is we're called to look into the world and see where things have become broken and not turn people away from them, but redeem those spaces. God did not evacuate us from the world. He entered into our world and worked in it to redeem it, to draw it into himself. And so we're called to do the same thing, to enter into the darkness and say, let there be light, as Andrew Peterson says in his wonderful song. This is our calling as Christians, is to transform idols, things which mislead and draw people away, into icons, things which don't refract the light away, but point the light so that we see toward God, that we see through something toward God, so that the thing doesn't become an end in itself, but allows us to look through it. That's what an icon is. An icon is traditionally a painting of a sort that depicts a holy figure. And the sort of theological concept of an icon, of course, is that by observing the icon and contemplating it, one does not worship the icon, but one receives a heavenly light which is reflected through it. And as one of the great councils of the church actually affirmed, worships that which is reflected through it, not the thing in itself, but that which it points towards. And that's what we want to do. We want to open up. We want to make the world porous again, so that the light of God shines through everything and draws people to him.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, we are running out of time. So I need to finish up with the question I always finish up with, and that is, who are the writers who make you want to write, Joel?
That's a great question. Well, I'll give you a few people that have, there's certainly, I think, people that many of your listeners would agree are wonderful writers that they've heard numerous times before. Lewis and Tolkien and Lingle and others I just adore and have so deeply shaped me. But I'd say more recently, this year especially, as I've been under lockdown, there have been some key books that I've read that I've really enjoyed. On a fiction level, I really, really enjoyed Susanna Clarke's Piranesi. Susanna Clarke, the way she writes makes me want to be a writer, makes me want to be a better writer. There's a precision to her prose. No word is wasted. It takes her a while to write. I think I think there's about 16 years between her last book and this most current one. It's not a long novel, but every single word is used. And sometimes you won't even recognize that it's been used cleverly until several sentences later. And then you'll suddenly realize, there's been this recapitulation of this sort of verbal theme. And it's just amazing.
Well, I've heard that's great. I have not read that book. I need to.
It's fabulous. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And she herself fully admits that she's dealing with themes that you would find in places like Lewis. She's a big fan of Lewis's. And in some sense, I think is carrying his legacy forward. One of the authors, I think, is carrying his legacy forward. On a nonfiction level, I've recommended this book in previous years, various places as well, but I'm just now starting to read his book, The Eucharist. Alexander Shmemin. He's a Russian Orthodox priest, 20th century Russian Orthodox priest. Wonderful, wonderful writer. I just love the way that he is sharing. When in any of his writing, he's talking about theology, big concepts about the sacraments and about liturgy and about the Eucharist, all these sorts of things. But he does it in a way that's it's almost devotional. It's always with this realization that our words are always, in some sense, when we're talking about God, they ought to be a worship of God as well. We should never talk about anything to do with God in a clinical way. We should always have a sense in which when we speak of God, we speak of him with reverence and with honor and with worship. And his books read like that, even though I gain enormous knowledge through them about theology. And so I've been reading his book, The Eucharist, but the key book that I absolutely love is For the Life of the World, which is sort of an overview of liturgy and sacrament.
Yeah, great book.
Similar to him in that regard is a Jewish writer, Abraham Heschel, who has that same kind of almost mystical sensibility. So I highly, highly recommend Heschel. Heschel talks about sort of time as a sacred aspect in his book, The Sabbath. And it's a book I also highly recommend. And then I'll just end with a book I read recently and absolutely adored. Martin Schleske makes me want to be a writer. He makes me want to write better. He makes me want to write more reflectively and more thoughtfully. He is he's one of the finest violin makers in the world. He lives in Germany. And he wrote a book recently called The Sound of Life's Unspeakable Beauty. And this book is just his reflection on sort of the analogies for spiritual life from the process of creating a violin. And he shares a lot from his own life. It's a translated book. It was originally written in German, beautifully translated. But his reflections are just so full of life. And I think in that sense, more than making me want to be a better writer, he makes me want to be a more attentive writer. He makes me want to be a writer who's more embedded in my world and responding to it more fully. Yeah. So those are my recent reads that have made me want to be a better writer.
Those are great. I want to read all those. Well, Joel Clarkson, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast.
It's been such a pleasure.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.